Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the University of Delaware's National Agenda program. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. This is the final program of the 2012 presidential election season. I'm really very, very pleased that all of you are here tonight, and I know that's a tribute to our two guest speakers this evening. 2 years ago, in the turbulent wake of the shellacking President Obama took in the midterm congressional elections, the architect of the president's 2008 election victory, David Plouffe, stood on this very stage and predicted that the electorate voting in 2012, this year, would be more diverse, more moderate, and younger than it was just 2 years earlier. He talked then about the rapidly growing Latino electorate, and he predicted that the Obama campaign in 2012 would have to work hard to take advantage of those demographic opportunities. Plouffe also predicted on this stage that the American people in 2012 would have had enough of Republicans who were like Glenn Beck, Sarah Palin, and Rush Limbaugh. We're just 1 week past the 2012 election tonight, and we now know all those predictions proved accurate. Even Fox News on election night had to swallow hard when its frequent predictions of a Republican victory proved to have been based more on wishful thinking than on hard analysis of the real world. And our other speaker tonight, Steve Schmidt, also predicted on this very stage after the last presidential election that the Republican Party would have to remake itself in the face of demographic changes rapidly unfolding in the United States. Both Plouffe and Schmidt are alumni of the University of Delaware's political science program, along with Joe Biden. Who has just been reelected, of course, to a second term as Vice President of the United States. Together, they are the reason the University of Delaware has been called the epicenter of politics. And since then, yet another alumnus of our political science program, Governor Christie of New Jersey, has also demonstrated his brand of politics, also based on reality rather than wishful thinking. Christie embraced President Obama after Hurricane Sandy, to the dismay of some in his own party who saw Christie's reality-based actions as undermining the GOP presidential candidate. These days, Steve Schmidt is vice chairman for public affairs of one of the world's largest public relations firms, Edelman. Since running the McCain campaign in 2008, Schmidt has consulted to political campaigns around the world. And you've seen him regularly on MSNBC and NBC during the 2012 U.S. campaign. He was campaign manager for the landslide re-election of California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2006. And before that, a top political advisor in the White House of President George W. Bush. Steve attended the University of Delaware from 1988 to 1993. David Plouffe crossed paths with Schmidt at UD in the late 1980s. He completed his political science degree and graduated right here 2 years ago. David has now engineered President Obama's 2 successful presidential bids. He was appointed as a senior advisor to the president inside the White House in 2011. He was raised in Wilmington and attended St. Mark's High School before serving in a wide variety of state and national political campaigns. I'm going to ask the two speakers this evening to speak, and I had to decide, who's going to go first, and I decided to use a standard that anyone in this audience could meet, and that is whoever's won the most recent presidential election gets to speak first. I think that's a fair enough thing to do, so please welcome David Plouffe and Steve Schmidt to the University of Delaware, their alma mater.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. It's great to be back in Delaware, where both Steve and I had our interest in politics really fostered and have such great memories of the university and its faculty and the community. We talked on the way over here that we wanted to keep our remarks fairly brief so that we could spend a lot of time in dialogue with all of you, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions about the election that just passed and what's going to happen in elections and in our government in the years to come. So I would just make a few points. By the way, Ralph, given your introduction, had we not won, I'm sure you would have reminded me of all the things I said that didn't come true. So this is a much more pleasant engagement given the results from 8 days ago. But I think that, listen, it takes a long time to really reflect on an election, to really understand exactly what happened, and more importantly, what that means for politics going forward. I think there's been a lot of discussion of demographics, and I'm sure we'll talk about that tonight, and that's an important part of our election because our country and our electorate is changing, and changing fairly rapidly. But that is, I think, not the core reason that the president won re-election. Obviously, the American people take presidential elections enormously seriously, as they should. And they really needed to think about what the president was offering in terms of an economic direction, a foreign policy direction, a direction on social issues. Had to reflect on the road we've just traveled in the last 4 years. And then, as voters always do, they spend a lot of time thinking about the future. So in the next 4 years, who can I trust on the economy, on social issues, on foreign policy? And we live in a country that's evenly divided politically, and historically we have very close elections. Our victory in 2008 was an exception to that. We won by what is considered to be a landslide, but we still had 47% of the country vote against us. Remember that. And it was clear that this election was going to be closer, given the economy, given the divisions in the country. But that being said, we still won an electoral college, maybe not a landslide, but a clear majority. Our popular vote margin now is approaching 3%, which for an incumbent president is a healthy margin. And I think the reason we won was people understood where we had been economically. All of you have lived through the recession. You know, this is not something that's an academic theory. Everyone painfully lived through the recession. We're beginning to recover from that. The economy has created jobs for 28 straight months, over 5.5 million jobs. The unemployment rate's come down over a full point in the last year. Our economy's far too weak, but I think the electorate said, okay, I'm beginning to feel some progress. Does that mean I'm satisfied with where we are? Of course not. But I'm beginning to feel some progress. And I think people thought it became a risk to then go back and try some of the same economic policies that led to the recession in the first place, or certainly contributed to it. I think there was a sense that on issues like energy and the environment and on education, that the president had a vision for where America needs to be in this new century, where we've got rising competition in places like China and Germany and India. And if we're going to have a thriving century, an American century, we cannot come in second place to those countries in the new technologies and industries of the future. And I think that that played an important role as people were saying, which way am I going here? There was a sense that, you know, the Obama vision was one that they thought better suited this moment in our country's history. And there's no question on social issues, that whether it's women's health care, whether it's immigration, whether it's gay rights, there was a set of issues that, particularly for younger voters, really was important to think about the kind of country and the kind of president that they wanted representing them. So on all those questions, people wrestled with them very, very carefully. The economy was the dominant issue. But I think that's why ultimately enough people in enough battleground states chose the president to continue this journey that we're on. Now, quickly in terms of demography, you know, there is, we don't know this for sure, but we could be seeing very different elections in off years and on years. The electorate of 2010, maybe 14, maybe 18, is going to be quite a bit different than presidential year electorates. And the comments Ralph mentioned I made 2 years ago were predicated on what we thought would happen in a presidential year. And that's what happened. You had Latino turnout in many states surging. The president not only winning more of the Latino vote than he did 4 years ago, but even winning the Cuban vote, the first time a Democratic candidate for president has ever won the Cuban vote in Florida. You saw young voters actually exceeding in most states their turnout from 4 years ago, to the surprise of most analysts. You saw African American turnout. Even though the excitement of the first African American president was 4 years ago, you saw, I think, a real determination there to support the president. You saw African American turnout rise in a lot of places. Now, that is getting a lot of attention, as it should. You have to understand the changing American electorate to understand presidential politics. But let's not forget, the president carried most of the key suburban counties in this country. Bucks County to the north of here in Pennsylvania, Hillsborough County in Florida, the states that are the four heaviest in white population, the president won all four of them. So it's maybe convenient to say that we drove good turnout in the Latino and African American community, but it's a much more complex dynamic because the president won swing suburban voters and swing suburban women all over the country. In fact, our share of the female vote increased in many battleground states like Virginia, like Iowa, like Florida. So presidential campaigns are complicated. The pursuit of 270 electoral votes is complicated. How we won 332 electoral votes is complicated. It's not just one thing. And we'll talk a lot tonight about what that means for politics going forward. One thing I've learned is you better not overlearn lessons of elections that just happened, because our country and our politics are changing so very, very rapidly. The important thing now that the election's over is hopefully we'll have a moment in Washington where our leaders can come together and on issues of tax reform and fiscal policy and job creation and education and immigration and energy, now that we're no longer, the looming issue of we have a re-election, that's done. Barack Obama's run his last campaign. And you have divided government. I think the one mandate the American people were sending was simply a mandate to work together, which is focus on us. Don't focus on what divides you as politicians. Focus on us. And, I don't offer misplaced optimism very often because when you're in Washington, you can get pessimistic real quick. But I do have a great deal of confidence that there is a pathway on immigration reform, on a long-term deficit reduction deal, on tax reform, on continued education reform, on doing some smart things around energy. And that's really the test of the president, the leaders in the Senate and the House is, can they come together now post-election? And for a period of time anyway, put your needs and the needs of the country first. And I have a great deal of confidence that we'll do that. So I look forward to talking to you about the election that just happened.
Thank you, Ralph, for having me back. It's great to be back at the University of Delaware, and thank you all for coming. So when we look at this election in 2012, Republicans should not be deluded about the magnitude of the president's reelection victory. This was a big night for the Democrats, not just at a presidential level, but also look across the country in the U.S. Senate seats. And for my fellow Republicans in the room, to quote John McCain quoting Chairman Mao, it's always darkest before it's completely black. And but as we look at this election, there's a couple of things I think that are just astounding to focus on. The last presidential candidate who achieved 60% of the white vote in the country was President George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush 41, and he received over 400 electoral votes 24 years ago. Mitt Romney, with 60% of the white vote in the country, is defeated pretty resoundingly. In the 2004 Bush campaign, we received 44% of the Latino vote in the electorate. We were having discussions in the White House in 2005 that we were within the territory that we were able to get to majority status with Latino voters in the country. And if you look at the election results where Mitt Romney is below 30%, you can really see the Republican Party's deliberate strategy to antagonize the fastest growing demographic in the country paying off. And so when we look at it as a party and we look at the demographic changes in the country, in the Mountain West, but also give consideration to the fact that some of the fastest growing Latino population states are places like North Carolina and Ohio, and not necessarily the southwest border states and states in the Rocky Mountain West. We also have to look in this election at the fact that we have now given up as Republicans 5 U.S. Senate seats in 2 election cycles because the nominees in those seats were manifestly unqualified to serve in the United States Senate from intellectual level, from a knowledge level, and from a social extremism level. And their candidacies were rejected not just by Democratic voters and not just by moderate swing voters, but by an awful lot of Republican voters as well. And if you look now at the functional majority of Democrats in the U.S. Senate, Republicans should understand that when you nominate people like Murdoch in Indiana, Mr. Legitimate Rape, Todd Aiken in Missouri, I'm Not a Witch, Christine O'Donnell, Sharon Engel, who might have been the goofiest of all, Ken Buck in Colorado, it's impossible to advance a conservative agenda in the country, because in order to advance a conservative agenda, you need to be able to win elections. And let's talk about this idea of conservatism tonight a bit, because conservative, for too many voters in this country, has become synonymous with absolute looniness over the last couple of election cycles. And we have a problem in the Republican Party that the Democrats had to deal with in the 1970s and 1980s, when our policymakers, our elected political leaders, are scared to death to stand up to the special interest groups in the party. And chiefly in the Republican Party, that's the conservative entertainment complex. Conservatism is a serious governing philosophy that has served the country well over its history. Conservatism is not a cult of personality, where we define who is and who is not a conservative over their fidelity to outrageous statements that talk radio hosts like Mark Levin or Rush Limbaugh makes. The mark of a true conservative isn't fidelity to Rush Limbaugh stigmatizing, bullying, and calling that young lady a slut. And it's time for our policy leaders, for our elected officials in the party, to stand up to it and to say enough is enough. And until we change the tone, we're going to have a very difficult time even getting to first base with voters. If Latinos don't think you as a party or the elected leadership of the party like you very much, then you're not going to hear your message on economic growth or your message on education reform. They'll simply stop at the place where they don't like us very much, so I won't listen to them. And part of the problem we have is that if you were to play a word association game with our elected leadership in the Congress, and you were to say, for example, Latino, the answer would be illegal immigrant from too many of them, as opposed to maybe lieutenant colonel or doctor or Silver Star winner or teacher or mayor or governor. And so until the Republican Party can begin to talk to this community through a prism of respect, understand that the contributions that they make the country a stronger place, that the strength of our country has always been, and at least part because of our diversity and the strength of immigrants, we're going to have a really difficult time in this election. I've been married for 12 years, and outside of my marriage, in a country of 330 million people, I have no idea how any other American uses birth control, with the exception of Rick Santorum. And I don't know why he wants to talk about it, why he thinks it's an urgent national security issue, and why the Republican Party is doubling down on issues like this. The pro-life position is a serious moral position. And I think the fact that on this issue the country is closely divided, and there is no evidence to suggest that being pro-life is a disqualifier to be elected president of the United States. But surely we must understand the difference, that being pro-life doesn't default you into being anti-contraception. And women in this country, particularly suburban women, particularly young women, don't want to hear lectures on contraception from white 50-plus Republicans. We are the limited government party. And we see too often now from the leadership in Washington a version of big government conservatism, where the government is peering through the window into matters of sexual orientation, into lifestyle choices, and issues like contraception. And so there's an intellectual dissonance when you have people talking about the individual mandate and screaming about tyranny and that we stand on the precipice of 1,000 years of darkness, but at the same time are voting for people in state legislatures who are mandating transvaginal probes for a legal procedure. It doesn't add up, it doesn't make sense, and it's being rejected. It's going to continue to be rejected across the country. And if you look at the increasingly extreme social agenda put forward by Republican candidates, I ask you this question. How do we possibly win in a state like Colorado that's legalizing marijuana when our candidates are out there talking about legitimate rape? Can't be done. So we have a lot of soul searching to do as a political party on this issue, on these issues. We also have to understand as Republicans when we think about the middle class in the country, what was our offering in this election to the middle class voter? Income inequality is a real issue. Wage stagnation in the middle class, it's a real issue. Declining opportunities in the middle class are a real issue. What is our answer to it? Certainly, we're not going to create economic growth on a platform of we're going to get rid of Medicare for everyone under 50 years old. A popular program, entitlements need to be reformed, but our message is all stick, no carrot. We don't have a forward vision of economic growth, how to create it, how to sustain it, that's in the interest of the middle class, and we paid a tremendous penalty for that over the course of this election. So the Republican Party has a demographic problem, it has a message problem, it has a policy problem, and then in the execution of the campaigns, it has a technology program. The Obama campaign in 2012 was 10 light years ahead from a technology perspective in being able to identify voters, target voters, turn out voters, and the Republican Party, through this defeat, is going to need to go through a cycle of innovation to catch up and to pass the Democrats and our ability to do that over the next couple of years. Lastly, what I would say is when you look at the Republican Party today, on issues from gay marriage to immigration to education reform, Republicans have always thrived when we have embraced our small government, our limited government ethos, and the principles of federalism, which have endured and have served the country well for over 2 centuries. And as we look ahead into the next election, I think that it's important for us to have some optimism as Republicans that we will have a class of serious governing officials who have solved real problems, have had reality-based solutions to issues that are, whether it's health care reform or education reform in the states or about how to grow the economy, that are consistent with the actual solutions to problems that we face today. And so our ability to go and to communicate to all manner of voters in this election and to deliver them our policy ideas is conditional on our ability to reach them through the prism of mutual respect, tolerance, and understanding. And the more intolerance that is emanated out from some of the talking heads in the Republican Party, the more we will continue to be shut off and shut down and not even be able to be in a position to make a sale to voters out in the electorate. So after a defeat like this, there's always a period of soul searching, and it may be that Republicans have to lose another election or two in order to understand that the party has to meet voters where they are and not the other way around. And the Democrats have struggled with this in the past, and ultimately Bill Clinton was a figure in the Democratic Party who was able to rebrand and change the party's image. And the Republican Party, it remains to be seen who our Bill Clinton will be. But at the current trajectory, we're going to have an incredibly difficult time winning presidential elections for the foreseeable future, absent an ability to communicate in a much more effective way with a lot of these groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much, and I want to personally thank both of you for coming up here tonight. I know it was a challenge for both of you to do it, to make it here. As you can see, all of us here in Delaware are very appreciative of your presence here. I know we want to talk about the future, and we've got to do that, but there are a few things we got to get cleared up and maybe out in the public about what happened in the election. I just want to ask each of you about whether there were aha moments or OS moments in the course of the campaign. For example, David, you were watching the first debate, I'm sure, probably glued to the television set. How many minutes into that debate did it take you to realize that this was an OS moment?
I figured you'd go there, Ralph.
No.
I was joking earlier, talking to some of the students. You know, for us, in the Barack Obama experience, we always have our moments of near death. So, in a way, this election was going so smoothly that it would have been very unusual if we had just landed the plane with no turbulence. So, in some respects, this was an inevitable thing to happen. I think that, listen, the history of presidential incumbents. If you look at President Bush's first debate with Senator Kerry,
an inspiring performance.
Yes. Some of Steve's old colleagues, called it an unmitigated disaster. It let Senator Kerry back in the race. Even President Clinton's first debate was not one of his strongest debates in 1996. President Reagan in 1984 obviously had a debate that even though he had a huge lead, the race really narrowed, and he needed a second debate performance to stabilize. Obviously, President Carter had one debate with Ronald Reagan in 1980, and Ronald Reagan decisively won that. So we did not want to continue that sad and sordid history. And so it's not like we were naive about the challenge and the import. And for a lot of reasons, not all of them I can be candid about tonight, we did not execute. Strategically, myself and others could have done a better job. And I think the President himself said he had an off night. I think didn't make any mistakes, by the way. It's not like we had one glaring mistake, but not a solid performance. Governor Romney gave a strong performance, and we knew that. You look at Governor Romney, even going back to 1994, when he took a flyer against Ted Kennedy, he was a strong debater. He rescued his primary candidacy multiple times in 2012 by dominating debate performances. We knew this was going to be a strength of Governor Romney, and particularly after the 47% debacle, just showing up on the stage and, not drooling, he was going to come out of the debate strengthened and enhanced. We knew that. And he was too low. I mean, he was polling in some battleground states before the first debate at 42, 43, 44. An impossibility. Mitt Romney was always going to get 47, 48, 49 in states like Virginia and Ohio and Florida. So we knew that Romney was going to come out of the debate with some strength. We were not going to win the first debate. He was the only person on that stage that had something to gain out of the first debate, in our view. But obviously, we had a poor performance. He had a very strong performance. And so now, and we said this publicly, and most people didn't believe us at the time. I think it's now proved to be the truth. The race did not fundamentally change. Our support level stayed relatively constant. All that happened is that gains that Governor Romney would have made slowly over October, and that's what would have happened. He would have kept gaining ground, and the race would have eventually gotten closer during the last week. He gained it all of a sudden. He accelerated those gains. It clearly excited the Republican base. It helped them raise a lot of money. They thought they were going to win. So we wouldn't have designed it this way. But the structure of the race never really changed. And in the 9 battleground states that would determine the presidency that we identified 2 years ago, and those are the 9 battleground states that did determine the presidency, we thought in all of them, all throughout October, even first debate, we had a much better chance of getting to a win number than Governor Romney did. So that was clearly. Now, obviously, the 47% on the other hand was something coming out of the Republicans did not, I think, put on a terrific convention this time. I thought the McCain campaign put on a much better convention 4 years ago. We did. We had some strength. So the 47% tape was something that was an OS moment on the other hand. Which
I was going to ask Steve about that, but maybe it'd be worth hearing from him about it. But after the first debate, despite what you just said about the fact that you anticipated the polling results to continue in that direction anyway, maybe it all happened at once, did you have to make any sharp readjustments at that point? Or did you say at that moment what you just said, don't worry about it, this is where it was going anyway, it's okay, we're fine.
Well, we had to ensure we didn't have another first debate. So that was mission number one, although that was clear literally within, during the debate.
The president knew that, right?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of navel-gazing about was it as bad as everybody thought. It was clear. And so we knew what we had to do, both presentationally and message-wise. We obviously had to prepare for a Romney that was fairly elastic, more elastic than we had envisioned. And so I think that, the debates are not the president's strength. He did well against Senator McCain 3 years ago, but didn't dominate those debates. In the primary in 2007 and 2008, we lost more debates than we won. So while this was a strength of Governor Romney, presidential politics are kind of like a decathlon. You have certain events you're strong at. The decathlon, let's say the high jump was a debate. This was not the one we were going to win. We just had to get enough points. And so I think we came off the mat well. We won the second debate by every measure, and we really dominated the third debate. And the way voters look at these debates is they really did look at them as a package. And by the end of it, people said, okay, we think the president availed so well. So I think what people said after the first debate was they were very curious about whether this was just an off night or whether something more fundamental was happening here. And really within the first 5 minutes of the second debate, what voters said is, okay, he's back. And that's the bar we had to cross. But it was a challenging period because for about 2 weeks there, we were the gang that couldn't shoot straight. And Romney had all the momentum. And, I think there was a lot in the media that thought Romney was on his way to the presidency.
Steve, I'm going to ask you about the 47% tape. Was that, and you were not obviously in the campaign strategy room at the moment, but at what point when you first heard that tape come out, what was your immediate reaction? And I would have loved to be a fly on your BlackBerry watching the emails come through.
I remember I said, he said what? What did he say? It's really a remarkable statement when you think about it. And of course, when you make a misstatement like that, and there are categories
of misstatement.
Well, let me. I'm gonna.
All right, you're going to come back to that. All right. Otherwise, I'll come back to
it. We tend to call unfortunate statements in a campaign misstatements, and the Romney campaign went out and tried to characterize it as a misstatement. But when you listen to it, you understood that. It was given with fierce conviction and absolutely articulate, and and frankly, if you get a room full of Republicans all together and you're on your second bottle of wine, that's where the conversation goes, right? It's not the first time. It's not the first time, I've heard it. And it's just so fundamentally untrue.
But it wasn't a blooper. Right? You're not saying it was like a blooper.
No, I'm saying he meant it, right? That this is a part of the modern, mythology or perception of the country from an increasingly insular Republican world that through the conservative entertainment complex, where this is echoed all the time, is what Republicans are saying to each other. And it was a statement that so fundamentally demonstrated a misunderstanding of the country. Because, first off, if you look at that 47%, it's always a bad idea, if you're running for president of the United States, to attack 47% of the country. This is a top-line matter. But secondly, there's a name for a lot of that 47%, and it's Republicans. And the reason that 47% doesn't pay federal income taxes, for example, is because of Republican policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit. And you're talking about not only a lot of retirees, you're talking about the entire enlisted corps of the United States military. And it was an awful statement, and I think he paid a tremendous price for it. Just as you conceive of a presidential campaign, you don't want to push people out in a way. It's not a zero-sum game where in order to get 50 plus 1, we're going to stigmatize 49.9, or in this case, 47%. Politics is a game of addition. And this is what David has understood and the Obama campaign has understood so brilliantly, is how do we assemble a coalition of voters in a changing country to get a majority of the vote. And I do think if you look at that coalition that's been assembled, I suspect it will be enduring for some time in the way that the FDR coalition was, the Reagan coalition was, and now I think the Obama coalition will be. But that was a profoundly bad moment for the Romney campaign in this election.
David mentioned in his opening remarks 47%. It was coincidental, I think, that the number you said, President Obama lost 47%, and just now you said, Steve, that the 47% Mr. Romney was referring to was Republicans. Was that coincidental,
some of those? What it demonstrated is a fundamental misunderstanding of the country he wanted to lead. That's what that statement showed, right? And a lot of those 47%, right? What was he saying in the statement? What he was saying is that there's 47% of the country. I got to write those people off because they're not paying federal income tax, and because they don't pay federal income tax, they're a bunch of takers. You all in this room. And it had great sound effects, by the way, as the glasses were clinking and the china and all this stuff in the video.
It worked pretty well in our ads.
Right, right. But you in this room, you're the makers, right? You're being victimized by the takers, and there's nothing I can do about those takers, so forget about it. Right? Here's what I'm going to do. And it was a disaster. And in fact, a lot of the people in that 47% are, in fact, the base of the Republican Party.
David?
Well, and this is not because we're having a blue hand love-in. I mean, I think if the Republican Party were to listen to half of what Steve said in his opening comments, I think they would begin to rehabilitate themselves pretty quickly. And it's going to be interesting to see. I think there's going to be a civil war between, the view of people like Steve and the view of some in the entertainment complex and the hard right. And I really thought up here, I'm not going to say a single challenging thing about Governor Romney or pour salt in any wounds. But just a few hours ago, Governor Romney, it's reported by media who were on this call, did a conference call with some of his donors to thank them, a nice thing to do. And he said that the reason he lost was that the president had given gifts, his word gifts, to young people in the form of student loans and student loan repayment policy. Gifts to the Latino community by saying that DREAM Act kids will not be deported over the next couple of years. Gifts to the poor and African Americans with health care, which is ironic given the fact that we modeled our health care policy on Romney care. So that says a fundamental misreading about what happened. I'll pour more salt in the wound. Paul Ryan yesterday said the reason we won is we did well in urban areas. Okay, we won Wisconsin, we won Janesville, his hometown, by 24 points, and he lost it by 10. And it's not an urban area. So it's disturbing within 8 days that there's still this, think about that, gifts to young people, Latinos, African American, said gifts of contraception to women. So if that's your diagnosis, and it actually has eerie echoes of the 47%. And so, again, to the thing of soul searching. Now, Governor Romney's obviously going off the stage. Others who are going to be facing voters in 2014 and 2016 are going to be most prominent in deciding the direction. But I think that would be concerning to anybody out there in the Republican Party is thinking, okay, how do we get more square with the country as it exists today?
Because we just talked about these two episodes, moments in the campaign, and there were others in the campaign, I think technology played an interesting role in both of those moments and perhaps in others in the campaign. I'd love to hear you talk about that for just a minute. For example, in a previous era, the 47% videotape might never have been made, or it might have been an audio tape only, and then it would have been leaked to, I don't know, the New York Times or the Washington Post or some other newspaper or whatever, the LA Times maybe, and excerpts would have been published and there would have been questions asked about, well, what was really on the tape and was it out of context and so on. So I'd love you both, if you want to comment on the role that the ability to make and immediately and infinitely distribute the entirety of these kinds of moments has had on the campaign, and likewise on the debate, on the first debate moment. I know my students were kind of in a little Facebook bubble that night commenting on the debate, and it was pretty instantaneous that people are realizing something's going on here, and it starts to get distributed immediately, and a narrative about an interpretation of what was happening to the president was going out there right away. I don't want to frame this too much for you, but to what extent do you think the ability to capture and distribute infinitely instantly these otherwise moments that might be less important in a campaign have had in this election? Or do you think it's been the same thing for a long time, nothing really new here? Either one of you.
Well, I guess what I would say about it is that it's outside of the campaign's control. All of this now happens organically. It's no longer information flow is no longer top down. It is surround, and it is bottom up, and there is no private space anymore. So the time-honored tradition in politics of going to one group and saying one thing and to another group and saying something completely different and contradictory, you can't do anymore. And so when you try to do it, you'll be caught, you'll be exposed, and your character will be revealed. And in a lot of instances, it'll have a negative consequence. But for sure, when you look at the campaigns and what catches on, the campaigns to a fundamental degree have lost control of the ability to control the message and to control the dialogue. Everybody with a Facebook page, everybody with a Twitter account has an ability to weigh in and to shape the narratives and the story. And so the ability to navigate that raging river, so to speak, and go with the flow is an important aspect of a presidential campaign.
And you said that you thought the Republicans were 10 light years or whatever you said.
I think it's on a different issue. I think on the voter targeting issues, the data, the turnout operations, of course, the Republican software crashed on Election Day. I guarantee you, how many engineers did you have working on the campaign?
Yeah, dozens.
Dozens of engineers. I mean, we have a bunch of guys in the basement of the RNC in Washington, and so we need to really, where the Republicans should start right now is a top-to-bottom review of what happened in this election. Let's do a full-scale audit. Let's understand what the Obama campaign did. What's disturbing about both Romney's and Ryan's comments is the degree to which they will be believed and repeated inside the conservative media, because in fact it did not happen. And if we're going to we've already lost the election, right? That's over. It's about the next election now. So you want to start with an intellectually honest appraisal of what happened in this election. Who is their coalition? What parts of their coalition are we able to pick off? Who can we reach in that coalition? What messaging can we use to reach them? What policies can we use to reach them? How do we reach them? So you want to have a top-to-bottom review of what happened. You want to look at the technology that they used to turn out the vote and say, not only do we want to equal that in 4 years, we want to surpass it. But if you delude yourself into believing that, as Romney and Ryan said, that the outcome of the election was determined for the reasons they said it was, you don't have an ability to do that. So right when you should be at this low moment, taking your first steps to building a team to win the next election, we're still going in the wrong direction. And that's the bad side of it.
I think, first of all, video is king. So it used to be not too long in politics, if there was a front page story in the New York Times or Washington Post, an investigative story. This is how Whitewater started, for instance, was an investigative story.
And Watergate.
Watergate, that it would really drive the debate and the coverage. Nowadays, if it doesn't have a video component, it doesn't really go anywhere, because it doesn't get on cable news 24 hours a day, and it's not shared and retweeted and posted on Facebook. Video, so what made the 47% thing so powerful is obviously there was a video component. And I think the setting mattered. And that, the best ads we ran in the campaign that were comparative, some might say negative, were ones that used Governor Romney's own words, because there's no spin on the ball. It's just what he said. When he said, I want to get rid of Planned Parenthood, it was his own words. When he talked about the 47% and who they were his own words. They weren't our interpretation. They weren't some announcer trying to, cast it in a more negative light. The other thing about technology is, in 2008, I think we had good data. We had a good sense of who the electorate was. We used the internet well. We used email well. The world's changed completely. First of all,
even since 2008,
light years. So much of the campaign this time had to be oriented around social networking, because that's where people are spending most of their non-work digital time. For instance, this year, in 2008, we'd send you a list and say, Ralph, make sure you call your friends in battleground states and tell them to vote. This time, some of you probably got these messages. If you had someone who's a Facebook friend who lived in Ohio or Virginia, you got a message saying, check in with them and make sure they vote. Think about that leap in technology in just 4 years.
How did you know they had a Facebook friend in Ohio?
We just did. I'm not one of the engineers. There you go. And it wasn't perfect, but it made a big deal, right? And that was an actionable thing for people. I remember my wife called me one time over the last weekend. She said, I just got a message that I'm supposed to ask your sister who lives in Ohio if she voted. I said, yeah, that's what's happening out there. That's because, she, like a lot of people, was concerned about, are we going to win? Are we going to lose? And I kept saying, we're going to be fine. We've got this. That was another piece of evidence to her that, we knew what we were doing. But a Twitter consensus emerges immediately. So in the debate, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook, in both the media and the public, within 10 minutes, there's consensus that emerges about, what's happening, who's doing well, who's doing bad, who made a mistake, who didn't. And that is something that has to be understood about modern politics, is, an event that takes an hour and a half, whether it's a convention, whether it's a debate, people are not going to look at it holistically. There's going to be a consensus that emerges right away. And you're right, within 10 minutes of the first debate, we knew it wasn't going well, but the referees had decided that Mitt Romney already was having an excellent night and we are having a terrible night. And it was going to be hard to shake people off that consensus. So in every way, and I think that's one of the big challenges, the Romney, they really thought they were going to win. And part of it's because they were living in an alternative universe. How could Barack Obama get reelected? But partially it's because their view of the electorate, their data, their modeling, their engineering or lack thereof, was just fundamentally off. They thought this election was going to be more like 2010 in its composition than it was in 2008. And if that's what you thought, then you would be confident. Because, if the election happened among off-year voters, we would have had a very difficult time winning. But the electorate was more like 08 than it was 10. So technology, but think about that. Our campaign from 8 to 12 had changed in fundamental ways. So many people are on mobile devices now. Facebook is the dominant way people want to engage in politics. Email is becoming more of a fossilized thing for a lot of people. So you really have to adapt. And the thing I'm sure of is between 12 to 16 and between 16 and 20, there's just going to be huge progression in terms of technology. And, that campaigns that take full advantage of it, I think are going to be very, very much advantaged.
I want to get to questions from our audience. I want to ask you both to define something that you've talked about, each of you in your own remarks. Steve called it the conservative entertainment complex, and you just called it the alternative universe. But could you just sort of briefly, and it doesn't have to be both of you if you don't want to, exactly what are you talking about here? What do you mean by an alternative universe? What was going on? How would people in this room know that they were living in an alternative universe? How would they be aware of that?
Well, first of all, I'd say it's not unique to this election or the Republican Party. I mean, in 2004, when President Bush was running for re-election, many Democrats believed that he had a device on his shoulder so that he'd be given instructions during a debate. I mean, it's insanity. But yet, so I think in our politics today, both parties, want to construct, an image of their opponent that is not grounded in reality. So the alternative universe, I would say there's two alternative universes. One is the Romney campaign had an unrealistic view of what the electorate was going to be. And that was one of the reasons they lost. Certainly one of the reasons they went into the election confident that wasn't an act. They thought they were going to win. But there's this view of Barack Obama that's, if you just read and watch the conservative entertainment complex, how on earth could this guy get reelected? Because we're a socialist and we're weak on terrorism and, health care is going to destroy the republic and we're not honest. And that's not how most of America sees the president. Even those that voted against us, most of them don't see us that way. So that is the problem, and I think it's an underestimating of your opponent's strength and the reality in terms of how people view him. And there was almost a derision and a ridicule that I think, I don't fully understand the impact it played in the election yet, but I know it played a deep impact. And so I think that, and listen, as I said, our party's gone through that before, which was a disbelief that President Bush could be elected in 2004. And obviously, 51% of the country, importantly, people in Ohio and Florida, saw it quite differently.
I think that there are any one of a number of legitimate policy criticisms of President Obama. And there are issues that he has advanced in the country that, as Republicans, I just disagree with. However, if you go back to Mitt Romney's book, what was the title? No Apology, right? Inferring that the president runs around the world apologizing for America. Not true, right? That never happened. The birther nonsense, the attempts from day one to delegitimize the president, that he wasn't born in Hawaii, that he is an alien imposter in the Oval Office, he's a socialist, he's a Marxist, the conspiracy began 20 years ago. All of this deranged nonsense had a terrible impact, not on the president, but on Republicans. For anybody out there that thinks that Mitt Romney running around with Donald Trump was anything but good, for Barack Obama, they ought to get out to Colorado, and start smoking it. I mean, it has been for 4 years, right? This utter and complete nonsense about the president spewing forth that Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to talk about, that everyone's entitled to their own opinion but not their own facts. Well, we now live in a media universe where there's the ability to have alternate factual realities to the great disservice of the country as a whole. But in the case of this election, it really impacted in a negative way, I think, on Republicans. We would have been much better off running against the real President Obama as opposed to the sinister pretend President Obama. And the total lack of credibility with some of this stuff, I think, is just absolutely repellent to the middle of the electorate. And then when you look at the demographics, who is Rush Limbaugh talking to? He is talking to a demographic that's white, 65 plus, in rural. That's not what the country looks like anymore. So you have these talk radio hosts making millions and millions and millions of dollars a year, driving a message of complete and total ludicrous nonsense into the electorate, a lot of it poisonous. I mean, Mark Levin, number 3, number 4 talk radio host in the country, who cloaks himself in the mantle of Ronald Reagan, a man known for his civility and decency. A woman called up Mark Levin's radio show and had some dissenting viewpoint, and he asked her if she had a gun in the house. She said he did. He said, "Get the gun out, put a bullet in it, put it in your head, blow your brains out." And this is a guy who cloaks himself in the mantle of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would have been appalled by that if it happened. So you have this terrible tone. You have this actually factually baseless stuff that's spewing out, and it has the impact which you have seen, with these secession petitions that are being filed, that are all over the Drudge Report, or the people that are all over the conservative blogosphere or media sphere talking about it's the end of the republic. It just totally out of proportion response. I think that's how it manifests itself.
All right, we're going to your questions, and we'll stick to the national agenda tradition of having a student question alternating with a non-student question. So let's go for a student question first. Raise your hand up high, hard for me to see. Student question. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Schmidt, I've really been enjoying watching you on MSNBC, and people like you and John McCain make me actually start to understand the Republican Party to a degree that I admit I'm a native Californian, I didn't quite get. How can we have this dialogue of really actually talking to each other without screaming at each other so that we can have some sort of understanding?
Question is, can we have a dialogue in which we're talking to each other and not screaming at one another?
Hope so. Look, I think when you look at our politics and you look at some of the dysfunction in Washington, and now we have the fiscal cliff issues that are before the Congress, and I think it's a real open question about whether we're going to have a politically induced recession, which is remarkable to think about it. It's not a cyclical economic event. We're 40, 50 days away. You'll see a lot of turbulence in the markets over the next month. But this is a political crisis, not an economic crisis. It's a political crisis that's going to bring about an economic crisis if it doesn't get solved. But for the entire history of the country, people who profoundly agree with each other profoundly disagree with each other, have been able, and sometimes don't like each other very much, have been able to sit across the table and to do the business of the American people. And that's what the moment requires now. On the question of screaming at each other, we should understand that there are tremendous market incentives for people to go on TV, to attack each other, to assault each other verbally, and you make a lot of money doing that. For the most part, moderate, reasonable voices aren't rewarded with media platforms in the country anymore, and you see a tone, and I think that this is a larger cultural issue. It manifests itself in politics, but I don't think politics necessarily drives it. I mean, on Facebook, on the comments on the chat rooms, anyone who has any level of public profile that says anything, right, left, center, the vitriol that is delivered to you, electronically, anonymously, it's quite incredible. And so, my view of it is that one of the things we've stopped doing in this country, really at an educational level, in our elementary schools and our high schools, is we've stopped teaching civics. And teaching civics doesn't mean teaching what it means to be a Democrat or Republican. It means teaching what it means to be an American and to understand that both parties are two of the great institutions that the country has. Both parties have served the country well, and that the competition of ideas that exists between the parties when it's working the right way to advance the country forward is a healthy and important part of our life. But Ronald Reagan always talked about the fact that in this country we don't have political enemies. We have political opponents. And I think it would be good if there was a renewal of that tradition, that we understand, even to people that we really disagree with, that as Americans we are all bound together and we have much more in common with each other than our differences, no matter how profound they may be on the ideological spectrum.
Okay, question from a non-student. Yes, ma'am.
In this election cycle, notoriously the highest amount of money was spent in campaign ads, and yet the turnout was lower than it was in '08. Now, to me that seems counterintuitive, but maybe the kinds of ads cause a lower turnout. Can we expect ever lower turnout as there's ever greater spending on campaigns?
Okay, question is about this campaign being the most expensive in terms of purchasing television ads and yet produce lower turnout. Is there a connection between the amount of money spent on television ads and the turnout? Or is there a connection between the content of the ads and the turnout, or maybe no connection at all? David?
Well, first of all, there's still millions of votes to be counted. So the expectation is the turnout, when all the votes are counted this year, will have roughly the same turnout as we had in 2008. And in the battleground states, again, what the presidential race is essentially a bunch of governor's races. So in 9 states, we ran a campaign. In 41 states, we did not. And in the 9 states, most of them are going to have turnout higher than '08. So where the campaign was happening, where the candidates were on the ground, where there was volunteers knocking on the doors, where there was an intensive use of technology to try and register and turn out voters, you saw turnout. So I think that's a good sign, which is the people in Ohio and Virginia and Florida and Colorado and Nevada, they obviously took this election enormously seriously. They understand the unique role they had to play. What's fascinating is these voters in the battleground states understand that they have a unique role that a lot of their fellow citizens don't get to enjoy because they're not in states that will determine the presidency. Now, the money, it's fascinating because the super PAC dynamic this time was obviously new and unprecedented. You had Senate candidates, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, a Democrat who won, had $40 million spent against him, not by his opponent, but by super PACs. We had, in the last week of our campaign, $100 million spent against the president in 9 states, $100 million on the air, which is more than the McCain campaign spent in its entirety in 2008, certainly in the last 60 days. It's a remarkable thing. Now, we still won. A lot of Senate candidates still won. But I think in House races it had an impact because Barack Obama, Sherrod Brown, governors, they have some definition. So that outside spending is a little less nefarious. It's still tough to deal with. But if you're not someone who's known and someone drops $4 million on your head, it's going to have an impact on you. So we've never seen spending like this. You know, there's a term about politics called gross rating points, which is the amount of television you buy. And 1,000 gross rating points mean the average viewer sees the ad roughly 10 times, and that's kind of the standard you want. There were some markets where we were at 3,000 or 4,000 gross rating points, which would be historical and astronomical. In this election, the Republican super PACs were at 9,000 or 10,000 gross rating points. If you went to Cincinnati, Ohio, or Las Vegas, Nevada, I spent a lot of nights in hotel rooms there, and you turn on the television, it was wall-to-wall political ads. And in many of those markets, you'd see 2 or 3 Republican ads for every Democratic ad. So what we do about this is a big question for our country because, you know, and there's strong differences on this. But we had one individual, spend $100 million in the presidential race. Think about that. One person spent $100 million to try and influence who the next president was. So I think that's only going to continue. I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching on the Republican side about we had all this money and it didn't produce much. Doesn't mean that it won't produce results in a future election. So I don't think it's going away. But this is a big question for democracy. In 2016, the Democrats and Republicans who are thinking about running for president, unless something changes, sadly, the first question will not be, how many volunteers can I put together in Iowa? What's my economic plan? It is, do I have the super PAC game put together to compete? Because without it, you won't be able to survive. Mitt Romney won his nomination. If he hadn't had a super PAC, we would have been running against Rick Santorum. Okay? So if you're Hillary Clinton or Andrew Cuomo, I'm not saying these people are running, but, you know, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, pick your candidate. And think about that. It's not about, for us it was, could we win Iowa? Could we build a grassroots campaign? What was our platform? I'm not saying those candidates won't have to deal with those issues, but if you don't have a super PAC game that's huge, you are not going to be able to win your party's nomination. And that's a really, really disturbing trend, I think.
Just a brief... In any given competitive congressional campaign in the country, the candidates committee, the actual campaign of the guy who's running for office or the woman who's running for office, has the smallest voice in the race with regard to these outside groups. And it's increasingly true in U.S. Senate races, and it's increasingly true even in the presidential race. And I think that's a disaster.
Brief follow-up to that. You've talked about the Senate, the congressional races, and the presidential race. Is this kind of technique that was honed and endorsed by the Supreme Court and so on in this election, presidential election, going to have an effect on issue campaigns as well? Are we going to find super PACs that are going to influence the outcome of legislation or tax code reform or you name it, whatever the issue is? Or is this strictly a candidate-driven phenomenon? David?
You know, I don't know. I think it's probably going to be more electoral focused, but I'm sure you're going to see, I mean, listen, somebody can just write a $20 million check and mount a campaign on whatever issue they choose. That's the world we're living in. They can write a check to mount an issue campaign. They can mount a check to try and buy a governor's race. They can mount a check to try and write a check to try and control Congress. And, you know, it's a poisonous thing for our country. And, you know, in Mitt Romney's campaign, for many of the weeks, the central actor, Steve is right, was not the Romney campaign, it was the super PACs. In our campaign, it was the Obama campaign. But we may be the last presidential campaign to be able to say that.
All right, question from a student. Yes, ma'am. Sorry. Okay, question is, given how unpopular the super PACs are, and I'm not sure about that premise, you guys can talk about that, is there any way to stop them?
Well, I think we've had a 30-year campaign finance regime in the country that has tried to characterize political money into categories. That some of this political money is good money, some of this political money is bad money, and we're going to try to put regulations around trying to determine what's good or bad. But the net effect of all the campaign finance laws and the Citizens United decision was totally predictable as a response to McCain-Feingold. You know, despite my working for John McCain, it was in spite of the campaign finance reform position, which I always felt was blatantly unconstitutional. But what we've done is we've weakened the political parties, and we've weakened the candidate committees. And the political parties have always been moderating influences in American politics, because the political party's goal is to assemble a majority, not to advance an ideology. The advancement of an ideology, by either party that wins is secondary, is a function of the majority. But now with all of the super PAC money, it's increasingly ideological money, and it's increasingly enforcement money. Reagan talked about the fact that if you are with me 80% of the time, you're not my political opponent, you're my political ally. But in a super PAC world where you have an apostate Republican or an apostate Democrat on an issue, you'll see the enforcement of ideological discipline through the use of the super PAC in a primary on either the left or the right. So it has the effect, I think, of polarizing the electorate in increasingly partisan, increasingly ideological ways. And because we have a First Amendment in the country, and because the First Amendment with regard to political money and speech has been interpreted the way it is, I think the only way you can fix this is to allow maximum contributions by anyone to a campaign committee, but it's got to go to the campaign committee. It's got to be instantly disclosed, because the amount of money that's flowing to these outside groups is not only a massive recipe for corruption, really on an epic scale. Think about what David said. A single individual, and that individual, a lot of the money, or other individuals, it's totally undisclosed, playing to the tune of $50 million, $60 million, $100 million in a presidential campaign. What do you want for the $100 million? Surely you want something, and I get you dress it up as, well, no, I just love my country, and this is the path I want to, I want to go down. But it seems to me that what you want to do is put the accountability in the campaigns, and you want to have a regime of instant disclosure. And I don't know how else to think about fixing it, but it is an enormous problem.
Considering that the candidates and the members of Congress who benefit from this system are the ones that would have to impose any changes, what do you think are the chances of refining any of this?
Well, there's only a select number of options in terms of remedy. Obviously, you could have the Supreme Court rehear Citizens United, but Citizens United is only part of the issue here. You could have efforts at more instantaneous disclosure. You could have a constitutional amendment process. So none of them are easy. What's interesting is you've seen both Republican and Democratic members of Congress, in the wake of all this super PAC spending, some Republicans in particular who favored it on the outset are having second thoughts about it, because it is this uncontrollable beast out there that's just going across the political landscape. And you've got people just deciding, I'm going to take this person out and I'm going to take this person out. And it's because they have an agenda. And Steve's right, the people who will be most harmed by that are people who don't just stick to the party line. Someone will run against them in a primary, and someone will come in and say, you know what, here's your $10 million of air cover. And think about what that means to people, because the only way we're going to make progress on issues, whether it's immigration, fiscal issues, taxes, is people in both parties are going to have to be willing to step out a little bit and take some heat. And if you're worried about these super PACs coming in and ending your political career, some real noble servants will still take that step, but it'll give people pause. So, there's legislative, there's legal, there's constitutional amendment, but it's a big concern. And I think for a lot of it, Steve said, candidates want to be in control of their own destiny to the extent they can. And I think the fact that they are becoming secondary actors in their own campaigns is something people in either party, I think in both parties, are going to become increasingly uncomfortable with.
You think of athlete sponsorships with wearing the Nike swoosh. Maybe they could wear T-shirts like Newt Gingrich, sponsored by Sheldon Adelson, candidate for president.
But it would say Adelson supporting Gingrich.
Absolutely. Wear like a European soccer jersey.
Yeah, right. Okay. Question from a non-student. Yes, ma'am.
This is for Steve Schmidt. I'd like to hear your opinion of Grover Norquist and the no tax pledge.
Okay, question for Steve Schmidt is, what's your opinion of the Grover Norquist no tax pledge?
So look, on the issue of taxes, it is true that we are at a historic low of revenue to GDP, and it has to come up because the country with $16 trillion in debt, which both Republicans and Democrats are responsible for, has to be fixed. And we have to get onto a sustainable economic path. Now, an essential principle of conservatism, Barry Goldwater said, tax cuts, yes, but deficit reduction first, is you got to pay the bills. So in your personal life and in public life. So if you want to have a prescription drug benefit under Medicare, it's great. Got to pay for it. Want to fight 2 wars? Got to pay for them too. You want to have tax reductions? Well, you got to pay for that too. And so we should understand something about the Republican Party over the last 10 years. It's been a big spending party. It just doesn't want to pay for any of the spending. So a reset of traditional conservatism requires that we be reality-based on the fiscal condition of the country and understand that the years of profligacy now require increased revenue. And the notion that we have hundreds of members of Congress are bound by a pledge to Grover Norquist, as opposed to their oath of office to the Constitution, is unsettling. And we should understand there's not symmetry between the parties on this question, because there is no Grover Norquist equivalent in the Democratic Party on this question. So it's encouraging to hear Speaker Boehner and Republicans talk about the necessity to increase revenues by closing loopholes. And, look, my personal opinion is that, and which, is why I'm a Republican in part, that a 40% federal tax rate is the top rate. That's an awful lot of money to take out of anyone's paycheck. I don't care how much money you're making. I want to see a more competitive, a flatter, broader tax system. And I believe that the purpose of the tax code as a Republican is not to create equality. It's not to decide who gets what share of an ever-shrinking pie. It's to collect the revenues sufficient to operate the government, and we should do it in the most efficient way possible. But clearly, when you look at the fiscal condition of the country and the consequences of going over this fiscal cliff, Republicans are going to have to abrogate that. That pledge, and it is not conservatism is not bound to a 35% tax rates. That's not one of the immutable principles of American conservatism. It's not. We want taxes to be as low as they can possibly be while running a government that is not bankrupt and in structural deficits for as far as the eye can see. So you're going to have to see Republican leaders step up here and meet the president somewhere in the middle on this to get the country's fiscal path on a path to solvency so we can start to have economic growth again in the country.
David, do you want to comment a little bit about what you expect in the next 6 weeks? It's not even 6 weeks, however many weeks it is between now and the start of the fiscal cliff. I realize you're working in the White House, so there's limits on what you can say, but how do you see this playing out between now and January?
Well, I think generally, now, Steve's exactly right, although, you are seeing, very conservative members of the House dig in on no revenues at all. But it is encouraging to see many Republican senators, Speaker Boehner, now saying we need revenues. You're right, I can't get into a lot of the details. I think that it's unrealistic to assume in the next 6 weeks you're going to have an entire fiscal package all buttoned up. So the president's been very clear, and he reiterated again today, we are not signing an extension of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy. But we do want to extend them we extend them for everybody because it's everybody up to $250,000, right? That's 98% of Americans will see no tax increase. But even if you're making $500 or $750, for the first $250 you're going to have a tax cut. We think it would be devastating to the economy to raise taxes on the middle class by an average of $2,000, which is what will happen if Congress doesn't act. And I know there's some, even in my party, who are trying to suggest somehow the fiscal cliff is not a big economic problem. It is. It would be a profound one. It would be deeply irresponsible, as Steve said, to create a recession through lack of political action. So on the immediate question of the tax cuts, we want to extend them for most people. But what we also want to do is engage in a process of tax reform. that would ultimately produce lower rates, even potentially for the wealthiest. A lower corporate tax rate, which is something the president called for in the campaign to help with competitiveness, by making the tax code simpler, clearing out a lot of loopholes. Now, there's just a reality of math, which is there's a certain amount of revenue you're going to have to get to put us on the right fiscal path. So there's a number that roughly is agreed to that, any Bowles, Simpson, any of the fiscal experts have said you have to get. So the expiry of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy is not the end of the story. We want to engage in comprehensive tax reform. We also need to engage in entitlement reform. Medicare, Medicaid carefully. These are chief drivers of our deficit. We made a lot of progress with Obamacare. There's a lot more to do. And there's other spending we have to cut. And so where I think the big bottleneck right now is Republicans in Congress around revenue and how much and where does it come from, Democrats are also going to have to step up here and do some tough things. And, the notion that somehow that these deficits and our debt are not a threat to our national security and our economic future is something I could not disagree with more strongly, as does the president. There are some, maybe not so much in our party, but some commentators on the left that suggest that we shouldn't deal with this at all. We have to deal with this. Think about, by the way, the damage the debt ceiling did to confidence in the economy. Let's say we actually could reach an agreement. I happen to believe, I'm not an economist by training, neither is Steve, but we've been around this enough to understand, as all of you have been, that would be a great driver for our economy. We are overperforming the rest of the world right now. We're not growing fast enough. If we can actually, for the business community and for the American people, say, we have our fiscal house in order for a 20-year period, we're still going to have room to invest in things like education and technology and research, it's going to set, I think, the conditions for our growth to even be stronger. So, but this is going to get hairy. It's always hairier than it should be. And this is big stakes. The debt ceiling obviously was concerning to everybody. But in some ways it was a little more amorphous for the average person. This means if Congress doesn't act, everybody in the country, everybody's taxes go up. And what that will do to those, think about that, $2,000 out of the pockets of most Americans, what that's going to do to consumption and confidence in our small businesses. So this couldn't be more serious. I remain confident because the stakes are so high, because there's these firm deadlines, that we're going to make some progress. I think what we need to do, and the president believes this, is let's go for the big deal. Let's go for something that we can say for a 10 to 20-year period, for the first time in a long time, our country's on the right sustainable fiscal path. The only way that gets done is for Republicans, again, to step out and get mercilessly criticized by Grover Norquist and the right. And it means Democrats are going to have to do some tough things on spending and entitlements that they'll get criticized by their left. That otherwise we're just in this perpetual sense of, we just want to have the issue. We just want to argue. We want to satisfy our base. And that's paralysis, and that's not clearly what the American people need right now. They need leadership. And Ralph's right, we only have about 6 weeks to demonstrate it here, but I'm confident that at the end of the day we'll get something done.
Okay, I'm going to go for a student question. Next student question. Yes, ma'am. Right here. Speak up, please.
As a Democratic daughter of two Republicans, one of which got her bachelor's and MBA from the University of Delaware and is now very successful, how can Mr. Schmidt sell me on the Republican fiscal policies that the Republicans put forward in a way that I see them as tangible and relatable to what I'm going to do as kind of this next generation that's going to accumulate this kind of deficit problem that you've spoken about in the past?
Okay, I'm going to shortcut, abbreviate the question, but I am going to keep in the bit about a Democratic daughter of two Republican parents. How can you, Mr. Schmidt, sell her on the Republican proposal for solving the debt and deficit problem?
Can I just say, knowing what your parents may be going through a little bit, that my son in first grade came home and announced that President Obama had won his class election unanimously, and that he was a Democrat. And he told me that with grape jelly covering his face, and I said, "It's okay to be a Democrat, but you must not eat like one." but but look, for Republicans, one of the things I was very curious about the election with Mitt Romney, as someone who is outside of Washington, right? He had no ownership of any of the congressional Republican dysfunction from the delay Congress forward at all over the last 10 years. So his hands were absolutely pure on spending. And he had the ability, I think, to rebuke both like Republican spending profligacy and Democratic spending profligacy. And I think that he was only credible in offering a criticism of spending under the administration if he was able to first talk about Republican sins in the area, and that we were going in a new direction. Look, I think that I think that Republicans confuse the word, by the way, oversight and regulation. Sometimes we need regulation, sometimes we don't need regulation, but we always need oversight over all of these people on Wall Street or big companies. You want a watchdog watching everybody. As Reagan used to say, trust but verify. And I don't care what industry sector you're in. But as a Republican, I believe that low taxes as possible, as less regulation as possible, to do everything we can to help entrepreneurs, to help small businesses, to help the job creator create jobs, and believe that the private sector creates wealth, not government. I think government does have a role in interacting with business and making investments. They certainly do. And you look at countries in Europe, for example, like Germany, where there are effective partnerships between government and industry. I'm not against that, but we should be able to deliver a message to the middle class of this country that our policies credible claims, that our policies will lead to economic growth, and that economic growth in the middle class, what is our remedy, for example, to deal with the fact that you've had real wage decline in the middle class of the country over the last 20 years? It's a real problem. And we've had anemic solutions as Republicans for it. So we want to go back to first principles on some of this stuff, and to come up with an agenda, to come up with a platform that's an economic growth platform. But for every young person in this room, to David's point, the debt that this country has is going to land squarely on you. And it's going to have a profoundly negative effect with regard to your opportunities and how the economy will grow if we don't get it under control. But one of the verdicts of the electorate in this election is that the middle class, where Republicans had traditionally done well with an economic policy, didn't do very well in this election. There's a bunch of reasons for that, but we need to really go back to the drawing board, using our conservative principles, under the principles of federalism, for example, of limited government. What is an economic growth strategy that is marketable and sellable to the American people, that speaks to their interests?
Okay, we'll take a question from a non-student. This will be the last question. Go ahead, sir.
I don't know whether Obama embraced anti-heritage or standing against Obama, but to me it looks like he did play a part in the outcome. And for instance, Governor Christie was already supportive of Romney to start with.
What's your question, sir? Okay, question is, did Governor Christie's embrace of President Obama on the tarmac in New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy play a role in the outcome of this election? And I'd like to hear David answer that first.
Undeniably no. I mean, this is a noble thing. Okay? Did somebody turn out to vote for the president in Colorado who wasn't going to turn out because of that? No. Did people switch their views in those closing days? No. We have the best data that any campaign has ever had in American political history. The race did not change pre-Sandy or post-Sandy, number one. There was a set of voters who had yet to make a decision, and they allocated the way we thought they were going to allocate, and Sandy was not a driver of vote, number one. Number two, you could say that it dominated the news appropriately for 2 or 3 days. So if you're the Romney campaign, you could say you had a hard time punching through that. So that may be one tactical concern. The thing I find most puzzling about this is the notion that somehow Governor Christie was getting criticism for this. Let me tell you, this is what leaders do. And any governor, Democratic or Republican, with any president, Democrat or Republican, who wouldn't have done the same thing ought not hold office. Your people are hurting, you need help, and that's what we do as a country. And it says something about our political situation that a Democratic president and Republican governor being civil to each other and figuring out how to work together is news. It's a remarkable thing. But no, I think that, there's a lot of, and it's a valid question, so I'm not trying to suggest the question is not valid. But you did see, some in the Republican Party and in the Romney campaign say, well, it was because of Sandy, or it's because now we've given gifts to everybody. It's because, the urban areas turned out. No, that's not why we won. We won because the middle class believed the president's economic message would be better for them than Governor Romney's message. We did a lot of things in the campaign well, used technology. I think we did a great job of turnout. We had amazing volunteers, and I know a lot of you were part of that, so I want to thank you for that. They are the real heroes of Barack Obama's presidency, the volunteers who are out there working so hard and funding our campaign. But the reason we won is, in those 9 battleground states, people had to put their thumb on the scale of who did they trust more with their future, and they chose the president. So no, it really did not. I mean, we were, listen, we had a beat on this election, and leading into Sandy and leading out of Sandy, we didn't see any change. Our research in Florida, in Virginia, in Colorado, New Hampshire stayed pretty constant because this election was very rigid for a very, very long time. There was very few undecided voters at play. Romney dropped in September because they didn't have a great convention because of the 47%, but it was an unnatural drop. He gained all that back pretty quickly after the first debate. So once he did that, there was very few voters at play. In reality, in states like Ohio and Colorado, there were 3 or 4% of the electorate that were in play during the final week. And some of them didn't vote. Those that voted, didn't vote because of Sandy. But I think it was, again, I think the lesson there is we could use more of that, which is we could use more of people of both parties finding opportunities to work together, not concerned about any of the politics of it or the electoral outcome, but just because it's the right thing for their citizens.
Steve, I know you have views on this. Can I ask you for a brief answer on the question of Sandy?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an important point for Republicans in the room. There's a tendency in campaigns to say that the outcome was determined by the last thing that happened, as opposed to the accumulation of things that happened over a 2-year period. So just to name a few, we could go back and look at our primary, which is something that resembled a reality show. The only thing that was missing was trapdoors on the debate stage. We can look at Mitt Romney talking about self-deportation, the 47%, the empty chair by Clint Eastwood. We can go on and on and on over the course of the campaign, including Mitt Romney's unpreparedness to be attacked on Bain, which he was first attacked on in 1994. And usually with 18 years head start, you are able to have a level of focus on things like that. You can look at the tax return issue. You can look at the decision that we're going to hoard our money to the end, and we won't do early advertising and allow the Obama campaign to have control of the Mitt Romney biography over the course of the spring and the summer. And in fact, if you look at the Romney campaign just chronologically, up to the moment of the first debate, there hadn't been a decent moment in the campaign since the spring. And he entered that first debate literally looking into the abyss. So it wasn't Sandy. It was the accumulation of all of these things and some of the demographics we talked about earlier. And then in the case of Christie, and this is why this is so pernicious for Republicans, is this is one of the most dynamic and effective leaders and popular Republicans in the entirety of the country. So attacking Chris Christie and blaming Chris Christie for this takes off the table one of the solutions to the problems that we've talked about. And so Chris Christie, we would be much better off as a party if we had another 10 Chris Christies in it. People who are unafraid to stand up to the interest groups in the party, a dynamic leader who understood that the campaign ended the moment that storm hit for him. He was one of the toughest partisans in the race, but understood. He raised his hand, he took an oath to the people of the state of New Jersey, and he was there with the President of the United States doing his job. He ought to be applauded for it, not condemned for it in the Republican Party, and it's a huge mistake for Republicans to do that. Just a huge mistake.
Okay, we're just past our time. I've got to close this off, but I want to, just so that I have the opportunity 4 years from now or 2 years from now or whenever it is that you're back here to list predictions that you make and, you know, show you both how right you are and so on. I want to ask, I'm going to name 3 candidates and ask you whether you think they're going to run in 2016, okay? Since you raised it, is Chris Christie going to run for president in 2016? Either one of you? Both? What do you think?
I'll say yes.
David?
I assume yes.
You assume yes. Okay.
I'll answer this for Republicans, by the way. On Democrats, I'll have to take the fifth. So.
All right. How about Joe Biden? Is he going to run in 2016? Blue hen?
Listen, I think that, I'm not going to answer Democratic questions. Obviously, we just got done with the election 8 days ago, and I know there's already a fascination with that.
That's so last week.
I know. But, right. And listen, I'm sure you're going to start seeing people of both parties go to Iowa, go to New Hampshire, go to South Carolina. It's going to start at the early part of next year.
All right, so no
the vice
comment.
president, but no, the vice president obviously has a day job. And I will say this, you know, he's a son of Delaware, but he's just been the greatest vice president you can imagine. And, you know, in both campaigns,
despite the fact that he's a son of Delaware?
Well, no, but in both campaigns, it's interesting. You know, he was overshadowed by Palin and Ryan. And so the invaluable role he plays is in the counsel he gives the president every day on official policy matters. But in the campaign, he was just out there each and every day. You know, his speeches weren't always covered by national cable. There was less coverage. He was going to, Steubenville, Ohio, and Durango, Colorado, and Marshalltown, Iowa, and just delivered an economic message centered on the middle class that was deeply effective.
You think Biden's going to run in?
No.
You're not. Okay, he's not. And finally, Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
Yes from Steve Schmidt, and you're...
Again, I'm going to take the
okay.
the maybe cowardly route here. Listen,
right.
but Vice President Biden, Hillary Clinton, these are people with great political futures if they decide to go down that path, but we'll just have to see.
Okay, I've kept you beyond your time. Before we say thanks to David Plouffe and Steve Schmidt, allow me briefly to plug the next semester Global Agenda program. Starting on February 27th, we'll explore America's role in the world, the way U.S. influence is felt across the globe in terms of our military, our pop culture, technology, innovation, influence on human rights, and promotion of democracy, and our role as a global policeman. Watch the Global Agenda website for information about our speakers after the first of the year. And if any of you are not already on the email list for programs like this, put your name on one of those bright orange sheets out in the lobby. Now, let's please thank David Plouffe and Steve Schmidt, our final speakers in National Agenda 2012. Good night, everyone. We'll see you in February.